A forgotten portrait reveals that the matriarch, presumed dead for 6 years, is alive in a secluded clinic. The discovery shakes the foundation of a powerful family, uncovering a web of lies, manipulation, and crime. Now, father, daughter, and grandmother must join forces to rebuild the truth and face the consequences. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. And now, the story continues. The morning arrived shrouded in mist, as it often did at that time of year in Oak Haven. The rolling hills that surrounded St. Helens estate seemed like silent guardians of ancient secrets, mute witnesses to stories that time insisted on hiding. The Cotswold autumn painted the trees in shades of gold and ochre, while the damp chill seeped through the manor's centuries-old windows, carrying with it the sweet perfume of the jasmine that grew wild. In the gardens, Amelia stepped off the intercity coach with a small wheeled suitcase and a worn backpack slung over her shoulders. Her 30 years bore the mark of someone who knew the weight of the daily struggle, but her brown eyes still shone with the characteristic curiosity of one who refused to stop believing that better days would come. She observed the discreet sign at the entrance to the property, with wrought iron letters announcing the estate's name. It was an imposing property, surrounded by ivy-covered stone walls, solid wooden gates, and an avenue of lime trees leading to the main house. She adjusted the backpack strap on her shoulder and began to walk up the avenue, feeling the crunch of dry leaves beneath her worn trainers. She had secured this temporary job through a recommendation from a former colleague at the care home where she had worked until 3 weeks ago. The offer was simple: to help organize a large birthday party that the Travers family would be holding in 2 weeks. It wasn't the kind of work Amelia usually did, but after months of unemployment, any opportunity was welcome. The manor house appeared before her like a building from another time. 3 stories of Georgian architecture, with wide porticos, white-painted wooden windows, and slate tiles that seemed to tell stories of generations. Around the house, carefully planned gardens displayed rose bushes, beds of hydrangeas, and those jasmines whose fragrance filled the air. Amelia took a deep breath, preparing herself to meet her employers. She was greeted by Mr. Anthony, the butler, a man of about 60, with meticulously combed grey hair and an impeccably pressed dark suit. He had the elegant bearing of someone who had dedicated his entire life to the service of a single family. But his tired eyes revealed something more, a kind of ancient sadness he tried to hide behind polite smiles. "Amelia, welcome to St. Helens estate," he said, extending a hand to help her with the suitcase. "Mrs. Victoria is waiting for you in the study. Allow me to show you the way." As they crossed the entrance hall, Amelia couldn't help but admire the refined decor. The wide oak floorboards shone under the light streaming through the tall windows. Period furniture, crystal chandeliers, Persian rugs, and a majestic wooden staircase that swept up to the 2nd floor. But what truly caught her attention was the gallery of portraits that adorned one of the side walls. Photographs and paintings from different eras showed the history of the Travers family: men with full moustaches, women in long dresses, smiling children in flower-filled gardens. Amelia walked slowly, observing each image with the natural curiosity of someone who loved stories. It was then that her eyes fixed on a specific portrait, an oil painting in a carved wooden frame. The woman in the painting was about 50 years old, with brown hair tied in an elegant bun, expressive eyes, and a serene smile that contrasted with her erect, formal posture. She wore a navy blue dress and was seated at a grand piano, her hands delicately positioned on the keys as if she were about to play a melody. Amelia felt the blood run cold in her veins. She knew that face. It couldn't be, but it was. Her heart hammered in her chest as she tried to process what she was seeing. Mr. Anthony noticed she had stopped and took a few steps back. "That is Mrs. Helen Travers, the matriarch of the family," he explained, his voice filled with reverence. "She passed away 6 years ago. An extraordinary woman, she dedicated her entire life to this estate and her family." Amelia opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. How could she tell the butler that this woman, supposedly deceased, was alive? that she herself had cared for her for 3 months at the Acacia Rest Home, a private rehabilitation facility in Cheltenham, where she had worked as a nursing assistant until being laid off due to budget cuts. "She's very beautiful," Amelia managed to say, her voice trembling. "Did you know her well?" "I've served the family for 40 years, replied Mr. Anthony, and the weight of an old sorrow appeared on his face. "Mrs. Helen was like a mother to me. Her passing left a void that has never been filled." Amelia swallowed hard. She needed to be sure before she said anything. Perhaps she was mistaken, perhaps it was just a striking resemblance, but deep down she knew it wasn't. Those eyes, the shape of her face, the way her hair fell across her forehead, everything perfectly matched the lady she had known at the home. The patient in room 15, an elderly woman diagnosed with advanced dementia who, in moments of lucidity, would talk about Jasmine, about an estate in the hills, about a son who never visited. Mr. Anthony led her down the corridor to a glass-paned door that opened into a spacious study. Seated behind a rosewood desk was Victoria Travers, a woman of 45, with carefully styled blonde hair, impeccable makeup, and a beige tailored suit that screamed sophistication. She looked up from the papers she was examining and fixed Amelia with a cold, calculating gaze. "You must be Amelia," Victoria said, without getting up or offering her hand. "I hope you're prepared to work hard. This party is an important event for the family, and I will not tolerate any mistakes." "Yes, ma'am. I'm here to help in any way necessary," Amelia replied, feeling small before this woman who emanated power and control. Victoria spent the next 15 minutes explaining the tasks Amelia was to perform: organize the guest list, check the menu with the catering company, coordinate the decoration of the ballroom, supervise the general cleaning of the house. It was a job for 3 people, but Amelia just nodded, jotting everything down in a worn little notebook she took from her backpack. Mr. Anthony took her to the room she would occupy in the staff annex, a smaller building at the back of the property. The room was simple but clean, with a single bed, a pine wardrobe, and a window overlooking the gardens. Amelia placed her suitcase on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, still processing the shock of her discovery. She needed to talk to someone, but who? She knew no one there. She wasn't certain of anything, and accusing the family of hiding a living woman who had been declared dead was an extremely serious matter. She decided she needed more information before taking any action. In the days that followed, Amelia immersed herself in her work. The manor was buzzing with party preparations, and she found herself caught up in an intense routine of tasks. But whenever she could, she would return to the portrait gallery in the entrance hall and look at the painting of Mrs. Helen. There was no doubt. It was the same woman. During the meals she ate in the kitchen with the other staff, Amelia tried to discreetly gather information. The cook, Mrs. Martha, a robust woman of nearly 70 who had worked there since she was young, spoke of Mrs. Helen with tears in her eyes. "She was a saint, that woman," Mrs. Martha would say while peeling potatoes, "never raised her voice to anyone, treated all of us like family. When she was gone, it was as if the light of this house went out." "How did she pass away?" Amelia asked, trying to sound casual. Mrs. Martha sighed deeply. "They say it was her heart. She was frail, you see. In her last years, she became very different, more forgetful, more distant. It was Mrs. Victoria, who took care of everything, had her admitted to a specialized clinic in London. They said she needed constant medical care. A few months later, we received the news that she had left us. We didn't even have a wake here at the estate. Mrs. Victoria said it all happened very quickly, that they had already held the service in London just for the immediate family." Amelia felt a tightness in her chest. The pieces were beginning to fit together in a disturbing way. No wake at the estate where Mrs. Helen had lived her whole life, a private service, in another city. And why admit her to a clinic in London if the one where Amelia had found her was in Cheltenham? "Was Mr. Edward very shaken?" she asked, referring to the family patriarch. "He was, but Mr. Edward has always been a reserved man," explained Mrs. Martha. "After he married Mrs. Victoria, he changed a lot, became quieter, more withdrawn. She's the one who runs everything now. And mind you, Mr. Edward owns all of this, inherited it from his father, who inherited it from his grandfather. But she's the one who makes the decisions. She's the one who signs the important company papers. Amelia absorbed every word as if they were pieces of a macabre puzzle. She needed to talk to Mr. Anthony. He seemed to be the person closest to Mrs. Helen. Perhaps he could confirm her suspicions, or at least listen to her without premature judgment. The opportunity arose 3 days later, when Amelia found the butler alone in the library, organizing books on an old shelf. The afternoon was fading outside, and the golden late-day light streamed through the windows, creating an almost magical atmosphere in the room filled with leather-bound volumes. "Mr. Anthony, may I speak with you?" Amelia began, her voice low and hesitant. The butler turned, noticing the seriousness in her tone. "Of course, Amelia. What's happened?" She closed the door behind her and approached, her heart beating so loudly she was sure he could hear it. "It's about Mrs. Helen." Mr. Anthony's face contorted into an expression of sadness. "What about her?" Amelia took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I saw her." The butler frowned, confused. "What do you mean, you saw her in a dream?" "No, Mr. Anthony, I saw her alive less than a month ago." The book he was holding slipped from his hands and fell to the floor with a dull thud. "What are you saying?" Amelia recounted everything. The clinic in Cheltenham, the patient in room 15, the diagnosis of dementia, the moments of lucidity when the lady spoke of Jasmine and an estate in the hills. She described physical details that only someone who had lived with the woman could know: a small birthmark on her neck, the way she moved her hands as if playing a piano, even without an instrument nearby, the way she pronounced the name Edward with tenderness and longing. Mr. Anthony had turned pale. He sank into an armchair, his face in his hands, his body trembling. "My God," he whispered. "My God in heaven." "Do you believe me?" Amelia asked, kneeling beside the armchair. He looked up, and there were tears in his eyes. "I always knew something was wrong. I always knew. The way it all happened was too strange. Mrs. Helen was fine, and then suddenly she started getting confused, disoriented. It was all so fast. And then, when Mrs. Victoria said she needed to be admitted, Mr. Edward didn't even question it. He seemed like another man, apathetic, agreeing with everything his wife said." "Why didn't he visit her at the clinic?" Amelia inquired. Mr. Anthony wiped his eyes with a handkerchief he took from his pocket. "Mrs. Victoria said the doctors recommended minimal visits, that it was better for Mrs. Helen's emotional stability, and a few months later the news of her death came." "But there was no body, no wake here," Amelia insisted. "How did no one question that?" The butler closed his eyes tightly. "We did question it, I questioned it. But Mrs. Victoria is very convincing. She showed papers, certificates, medical reports. She said Mrs. Helen had asked to be cremated, that it was an old wish of hers. Mr. Edward signed everything. He was devastated. He didn't question anything." Amelia felt the gravity of the situation weigh on her shoulders. If Mrs. Helen was alive, if she had been fraudulently declared dead, then a crime was being committed. But who would believe her, a temporary employee with no concrete proof, against a powerful and influential family? "Mr. Anthony, you have to tell Mr. Edward this," she said firmly. The butler nodded slowly. "Yes, he needs to know. But we have to be careful. Mrs. Victoria can't suspect anything until we're absolutely sure. If she finds out we're investigating, I don't know what she'd be capable of." That night, Amelia barely slept. She lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the nocturnal sounds of the estate. The wind in the trees, the distant song of a thrush, the rustling of dry leaves. She thought of the lady she had known at the clinic, that frail but dignified woman who, in moments of lucidity, would hold her hand and say, "My son, my boy, where is my boy?" Amelia didn't know for sure what would happen next, but one thing was certain: she couldn't remain silent. Not when an innocent woman was being kept from her home, her family, her life, under false pretenses. Not when the truth was right there, hidden behind forged certificates and well-constructed lies. 2 days later, Mr. Anthony found the right moment to speak with Edward Travers. The patriarch was alone in his study, reviewing documents from the agribusiness firm the family owned. He was a man of 55, with grey hair and broad shoulders that seemed to carry the weight of immense responsibilities. His face was marked by expression lines, but his blue eyes, which must have once been vibrant, now seemed dull, distant. "Mr. Edward, I need to speak with you about a delicate matter," the butler began, closing the study door. Edward looked up from the papers, noticing the tension in Mr. Anthony's voice. "What is it about?" The butler took a deep breath and began to relate everything Amelia had told him. With each word, Edward's face changed, shifting from disbelief to confusion, from confusion to distress. When Mr. Anthony finished, a heavy silence filled the study. "That's impossible," Edward finally said, his voice hoarse. "My mother is dead. I saw the papers, I signed the documents. How can she be alive? Mr. Edward, what if the papers were fake? What if this was all a setup?" Edward shot up from his chair, his expression fluctuating between anger and despair. "A setup? Are you suggesting that my wife, that Victoria, staged my mother's death? That's absurd, Anthony, that's madness." "But what if it isn't?" the butler insisted, taking a step forward. "You yourself admitted that everything was strange. The way she fell ill so quickly, the sudden hospitalization, the fact that we couldn't visit her, the hasty cremation without a wake. Did none of that seem suspicious to you?" Edward ran his hands over his face, breathing with difficulty. "It did. But I was so confused at the time, so tired. Victoria took care of everything. She said it was for my own good, that I didn't need to worry about the bureaucratic details." Mr. Anthony placed a hand on his employer's shoulder. "I know it's hard to believe, but what if the employee is right? What if your mother is alive and needs help? Wouldn't you want to be sure?" Edward was silent for long minutes, the internal conflict etched on his face. Finally he nodded. "Where is this home?" "Cheltenham, the Acacia Rest Home." "Then I'll go there," Edward decided, determination returning to his voice. "I'll find out the truth, whatever it may be." But that night, during dinner, Victoria noticed something was different. Edward was restless, picking at his food without eating, avoiding her gaze. She was a shrewd woman, trained to detect any change in the behavior of those around her. After all, that was how she maintained control over everything and everyone. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice soft but with a hint of suspicion. "I'm just tired," Edward replied, still not looking at her. Victoria didn't press, but her eyes narrowed. Something was happening, and she needed to find out what. In the early hours of the morning, while Edward slept under the effect of the medication she disguised in his wine every night, Victoria searched his study. She found notes about the rest home, the address scribbled on a piece of paper. A cold smile curved her lips. So that was it. Someone was asking questions. Someone was digging up the past she had so carefully buried. But Victoria Travers hadn't gotten where she was by being naive. She knew exactly how to deal with threats. She picked up her mobile phone and dialed a familiar number. The call was answered on the third ring. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low but firm. "We have a problem." On the other end of the line, a male voice replied with the same coldness. "I'll be there tomorrow." Victoria hung up and looked out the study window, observing the gardens plunged into the darkness of the night. The jasmines continued to exude their characteristic perfume, but for her there was no beauty in it. There was only the scent of a secret that threatened to surface, and she would do whatever it took to keep it buried. Meanwhile, in her room in the annex, Amelia was also awake. She felt she had started something much bigger than she had imagined, something that could change the fate of this family forever. She closed her eyes and whispered a silent prayer, asking for the courage to face what was to come. The truth was about to emerge from the shadows, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same at St. Helens Estate. The next morning arrived with a sky heavy with dark clouds that threatened rain. Edward Travers woke with a heavy head, as was often the case lately. That feeling of torpor that accompanied him from the moment he woke until he went to sleep, as if he were living life through a thick fog. But that morning something was different. The conversation with Mr. Anthony had planted a seed of doubt that was beginning to sprout in his chest. He got out of bed carefully, so as not to wake Victoria, who was still asleep beside him, her face serene and her blonde hair spread over the silk pillow. He watched her for a moment. This woman to whom he had been married for 18 years, the mother of his only daughter, the person who had taken control of his life when he needed support the most. Or was it really control? For the first time in years, Edward allowed himself to question it. He dressed in silence and went down to the kitchen, where Mrs. Martha was already preparing breakfast. The aroma of fresh bread and brewed coffee filled his nostrils, bringing a pang of nostalgia. His mother used to make breakfast on Sundays, insisting on preparing everything herself, even though she had staff to do it. She said that cooking was an act of love, and she loved this family above all else. "Good morning, Mr. Edward," Mrs. Martha greeted him with her usual warm smile. "Hot coffee, just how you like it." "Thank you, Martha," he replied, sitting at the kitchen table, something he hadn't done in years. Victoria insisted that meals should be taken in the formal dining room with the table properly set. But that morning, Edward felt a need for closeness, for human warmth, for something real amidst so much uncertainty. Mrs. Martha served him a cup of coffee and watched him attentively. "Are you all right, sir? You seem worried." Edward took a sip of the bitter coffee. "Martha, do you remember what my mother was like? I mean, before she got sick?" The cook sat down opposite him, wiping her hands on her apron. "I remember it like it was yesterday. Mrs. Helen was a woman full of life, active, interested in everything she personally tended to. The Rosebushes played the piano every afternoon, visited the estate workers to see if they needed anything. It was impossible not to love her." "And when did she start to change?" Edward asked, his voice heavy with an old pain. "It was after that day she and Mrs. Victoria had a serious argument in the study," Mrs. Martha recalled, frowning. "We never knew what it was about, but after that, Mrs. Helen became different, quieter, more distant. A few weeks later, she started having those memory lapses. It all happened very fast." Edward felt his stomach tighten. What argument was that? Why didn't he remember? Why were there so many gaps in his memory from that period? Before he could ask more questions, Victoria appeared at the kitchen door, dressed in a white silk robe, her hair tied in a bun. Her green eyes flashed with a hint of disapproval upon seeing her husband in the kitchen. "Edward, what are you doing here? I thought you were in the study," she said, keeping her tone polite but firm. "I was talking with Martha," he replied without getting up, reminiscing about the old days. Victoria approached and placed a possessive hand on his shoulder. "How nostalgic. But you have a meeting with the suppliers at 9, remember? You'd better get ready." Edward glanced at the clock on the wall. It was only 7 in the morning. "I cancelled the meeting. I need to take care of a personal matter today." Victoria's face stiffened for a fraction of a second, but she quickly recomposed her expression. "A personal matter? Something I should know about?" "No," he said, standing up and looking her in the eye. "It's something I need to do alone." There was a tense exchange of glances between them. Victoria smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "As you wish, darling. Just don't forget to take your medication. You know how you get when you forget." Edward nodded and left the kitchen, heading up the stairs to their room. The medication, that damned medication he had been taking for years for anxiety, prescribed by a doctor Victoria had chosen. Did he really need it? Or was it another piece of the puzzle he was beginning to assemble? As he was getting dressed, he heard a light knock on the door. It was Julia, his 17-year-old daughter. A beautiful young woman with long brown hair like her grandmother's, blue eyes inherited from him, and a sharp intelligence that sometimes frightened him. "Dad, can I come in?" she asked, peeking through the ajar door. "Of course, sweetheart. Come in." Julia closed the door behind her and approached. There was something determined in her expression. "I heard Mum on the phone last night. She sounded nervous, talking about someone who was asking questions." Edward stopped tying his tie and looked at his daughter. "Did you hear what she said?" "Not everything, but she mentioned the clinic." "Dad, what clinic is this?" He sighed, debating internally how much he should tell his daughter. Julia was young, but she wasn't naive. She deserved to know the truth, or at least part of it. "It's about your grandmother," he began, choosing his words carefully. It's possible that things didn't happen exactly as we were told. Julia's eyes widened. What do you mean? Grandma didn't die. I don't know, Julia. That's what I'm going to find out today. But I need you to stay here and not say anything to your mother. Can you do that for me? The young woman nodded, but there was fear in her eyes. Dad, be careful. Mum can be very dangerous when she feels threatened. Those words echoed in Edward's mind as he drove along the road to Cheltenham. His own daughter was afraid of Victoria. How had he been so blind for so long? How had he allowed things to get to this point? The journey took about 3 hours. Throughout the drive, Edward tried to mentally prepare himself for what he might find. What if Amelia was right? What if his mother was alive, locked away in a clinic, believing she had been abandoned by him? The guilt he felt was almost suffocating. The Acacia Rest Home was located on an isolated plot on the outskirts of Cheltenham, surrounded by high walls and iron gates. The facade was imposing, with the air of an expensive and exclusive institution. Edward parked the car and walked to the reception, his heart pounding in his chest. A young receptionist greeted him with a professional smile. "Good afternoon. How can I help you?" "I've come to see a patient," he said, his voice firm despite his nervousness. "Helen Travers." The young woman consulted her computer, her fingers gliding over the keyboard. "I'm sorry, sir, but we have no patient registered under that name." Edward felt a pang of disappointment, but persisted. "She might be registered under another name. She's a 75-year-old lady, grey hair, about 5 feet 3 inches tall." The receptionist seemed uncomfortable. "Sir, I cannot provide information about our patients without authorization. It's a matter of privacy." Before Edward could respond, a side door opened and a man in a white coat appeared. He was tall, around 50, with dark hair combed back and an air of authority that immediately put Edward on alert. "Can I help you?" the man asked, approaching. "I'm Dr. August Ferrer, the director of this clinic." Edward extended his hand, which was shaken with a calculated firmness. "My name is Edward Travers. I'm looking for my mother, Helen Travers. I have reason to believe she may be a patient here." The doctor's face remained impassive. "Mr. Travers, as has already been explained, we cannot confirm or deny the presence of patients without proper documentation. If you would like to schedule an appointment through the appropriate channels, we would be happy to assist you." "My mother was declared dead 6 years ago," Edward said, his voice rising a notch. "But I have reason to believe that may have been a mistake or worse, a fraud, and if she is here, I have the right to see her." Dr. Ferrer maintained his professional calm, but Edward noticed a flicker of tension in his eyes. "Mr. Travers, you are making very serious accusations. I suggest you seek the appropriate legal channels if you believe there has been any irregularity. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have patients to attend to." He started to walk away, but Edward grabbed his arm. "Please, I just need to know if—" "She's here. She's my mother." The doctor jerked his arm away sharply. "Security, please escort this gentleman to the exit." 2 guards approached, and Edward realized it was pointless to insist at that moment. He left the clinic with his blood boiling, but also with a growing certainty. Something was very wrong here. Dr. Ferrer's reaction was excessively defensive for someone who was simply following privacy protocols. He sat in his car, trying to decide on his next move, when he noticed a woman in a religious habit, leaving through a side door of the clinic. It was a nun, probably in her 60s, with a kind face marked by expression lines. She was carrying a shopping bag and walking towards a nearby bus stop. Edward got out of the car and approached her. "Excuse me, sister. May I speak with you for a moment?" The nun turned, surprised. "Yes, my son, what is it?" "My name is Edward Travers. I'm looking for my mother. I believe she might be a patient at the clinic where you work." The woman glanced around, making sure no one was listening. "I am Sister Beatrice. I've worked there for 15 years, caring for the elderly patients. What is your mother like?" Edward described Mrs. Helen in detail, every physical characteristic, every quirk. He mentioned the way she moved her hands as if playing the piano, the way she pronounced certain words, the birthmark on her neck. The nun's eyes filled with tears. "My God, I know her. She's the lady in room 15, but she's registered under another name, Maria Santos. They said she has no family, that she was abandoned." "She's alive?" Edward asked, his voice breaking. "My mother is alive?" Sister Beatrice nodded, tears now streaming freely down her face. Yes, she is my son, and she's lucid most of the time. She always talks about a son and estate, jasmine flowers. They say she has dementia, but I always knew there was something wrong with that diagnosis. Edward felt his knees buckle. He had to lean against the bus-stop post to keep from falling. His mother was alive and alone, believing she had been abandoned by him. "I need to see her," he said, desperate. "Can you help me?" The nun hesitated, looking back at the clinic. "It's very risky. Dr. Ferrer controls everything in there, but there's a time when he's not here on Saturday mornings. He travels to London for a weekly meeting. If you come this Saturday around 10 o'clock, I can take you to her through the back entrance." Edward grasped the nun's hands gratefully. "Thank you so much, sister. You don't know how much this means to me." "Just one thing, Mr. Edward," she added, her face serious. "Be strong. Your mother is frail, but her spirit is still firm. She's going to need you now more than ever." On the way back to Oakhaven, Edward could barely process everything he had discovered. His mother was alive. Someone, and he had a strong suspicion who, had forged her death, falsified documents, paid people to maintain the charade. But why? What reason would Victoria have for doing something so monstrous? When he arrived at the estate, it was already dark. The lights of the manor shone welcomingly, but for Edward there was no longer any comfort in that place. He entered through the back door, wanting to avoid Victoria until he had time to process everything. He found Amelia and Mr. Anthony in the kitchen, talking in low voices with Mrs. Martha. The three of them turned when he entered, expectation written on their faces. "It's true," Edward said, his voice hoarse. "She's alive. My mother is alive." Mrs. Martha let out a sob and covered her mouth with her hands. Mr. Anthony closed his eyes, murmuring a silent prayer. Amelia felt her eyes well up with tears. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. "I'm going to bring her back home," Edward replied, and for the first time in years there was genuine determination in his voice. "On Saturday I'm going to get her, and then I'm going to find out the whole truth about what happened." "Mr. Edward," Mr. Anthony approached, his voice low and urgent, "Mrs. Victoria cannot know about this beforehand. If she finds out, she might try to stop you, or worse, do something to cover her tracks for good." Edward nodded. "I know. I'll act as if nothing has happened. But we need to be careful. She's already suspicious." At that moment, Julia entered the kitchen, her eyes wide. "Dad, Mum's looking for you. She seems nervous." Edward took a deep breath, preparing for the performance of his life. "Thank you, sweetheart. I'll go up and talk to her." He found Victoria in their bedroom, sitting at her dressing table, brushing her blonde hair. She watched him in the mirror, a calculated smile on her lips. "Where have you been all day?" she asked, keeping her tone casual. "I went for a drive, to think a little," Edward answered, starting to take off his shoes. "I've been very stressed lately." Victoria turned to face him. "And did you manage to relax?" "A little," he lied, avoiding her penetrating gaze. She stood up and approached him, placing her hands on his shoulders. "Edward, you know you can tell me anything, don't you? We're a team, you and I. We always have been." He forced a smile. "I know, Vic, I'm just tired. I think I'll take a shower and go to bed early." "Excellent idea," she agreed, kissing him on the cheek. "I've already put your medication on the bedside table with a glass of water. Don't forget to take it before you sleep." Edward looked at the pill next to the glass. How many years had he taken it religiously, without question? How many nights had he slept under the effect of drugs he might not even have needed? "Thank you," he said. But this time, after Victoria left the room, he took the pill and put it in his pocket. He needed to be lucid, to think clearly. The days of blindness were over. On Saturday morning, Edward woke early, his mind clearer than it had been in years. He hadn't taken the medication for the past 2 nights, and the difference was staggering. He felt more present, more alert, as if a veil that had covered his thoughts had been removed. He told Victoria he needed to go to the neighboring estate to discuss the purchase of agricultural equipment. She accepted the excuse without much questioning, but Edward noticed the way her eyes followed him as he left the house. The drive to Cheltenham seemed shorter this time. When he arrived at the clinic, he parked the car on a side street as arranged with Sister Beatrice. The nun was waiting for him near the back of the property, at a discreet gate hidden among shrubs. "Come quickly," she whispered, opening the gate. "We have an hour before the rounds begin." Edward followed her through white aseptic corridors, the characteristic smell of a hospital filling his nostrils. They passed rooms with closed doors, from which came the muffled sounds of televisions and distant conversations. Finally, Sister Beatrice stopped in front of a door with the number 15. "She's awake," the nun said softly. "Prepare yourself, Mr. Edward. She's more frail than you remember." The nun opened the door slowly. The room was simple but clean, with a bed, an armchair, and a barred window that looked out onto an inner garden. And there, sitting in the armchair, wrapped in a woolen shawl, was his mother, Mrs. Helen. She was thinner, her hair now completely white, her face marked by wrinkles that weren't there 6 years ago. But her eyes, those expressive eyes Edward had known since he was born, still shone with the same light. The woman looked up when she heard the door open. First, confusion, then recognition, and finally an expression of pure disbelief. "Edward," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My son." He crossed the room in 3 long strides and knelt beside the armchair, taking his mother's frail hands in his. "Yes, Mother. It's me, I'm here." Tears began to stream down Mrs. Helen's wrinkled face. "I thought you would never come. I thought you had forgotten me." "Never, Mother, never," Edward said, his own voice breaking. "I didn't know. They told me you had died. I swear I didn't know you were here." Mrs. Helen raised a trembling hand and touched her son's face, as if to make sure he was real. "She brought me here, you know, your wife. She said it was for my own good, that I was sick. But I wasn't sick, Edward. I found something terrible, and she needed to silence me." "What did you find, Mother?" Mrs. Helen's eyes filled with pain and anger. "The papers, the accounts, the money. She was stealing from the company, embezzling funds for years. I found the proof and confronted her. The next day I started to feel strange, confused. And then I woke up here." Edward felt rage rise within him like a tide. It all made sense now. Victoria hadn't just faked his mother's death. She had poisoned her own mother-in-law to make her seem demented, to have an excuse to commit her and silence her for good. "I'm getting you out of here, Mother," he promised, holding her hands firmly. "I'm taking you back home, to the estate, to the Jasmine, and I will get justice." Mrs. Helen smiled through her tears. "My brave boy. I always knew you would come back for me. I always knew." Sister Beatrice approached, placing a hand on Edward's shoulder. "We need to hurry, Mr. Edward. Dr. Ferrer could be back at any moment." Edward helped his mother to her feet. She was frail, needing to lean on him to walk, but there was determination in her eyes. They left the room, walking quickly but carefully through the corridors. Edward's heart was pounding, expecting at any moment to hear shouts of alarm, footsteps running after them. But they reached the back gate without incident. Edward helped his mother into the car, covering her with a blanket he had brought. He turned to thank Sister Beatrice, who had already become an invaluable ally. "You did a very brave thing, Sister. I have no words to thank you." The nun smiled, her eyes moist. "Just take care of her, Mr. Edward, and bring the truth to light. There are many other lost souls in that clinic who deserve justice too." During the drive back, Mrs. Helen slept most of the time. Exhausted by the emotion and the effort, Edward drove in silence, his mind racing with plans. He had to protect his mother. He had to ensure Victoria couldn't harm anyone else. But how? She was smart, prepared. She had connections. Confronting her would be like facing a venomous snake. One wrong move could be fatal. When they arrived at the estate, the sun was beginning to set. Edward took the service road, wanting to avoid the main house for now. He took his mother directly to the guest house, a smaller building at the back of the property that had been closed for years. Mr. Anthony was waiting for them there, having prepared the room with clean sheets, fresh flowers, and everything an elderly lady would need. When he saw Mrs. Helen, the butler couldn't hold back his tears. "My lady," he said, kneeling to kiss her hand, "thank God you're home." "Anthony, my old friend," Mrs. Helen said tenderly, "how I've missed you." Amelia was there too, helping to prepare everything. When she saw the lady she had cared for at the clinic, she felt a wave of relief and joy. Mrs. Helen recognized her immediately. "Amelia, my dear girl, you were the only one who was kind to me in that terrible place. Thank you for bringing my son back to me." That night, while Mrs. Helen rested in the guest house under the care of Sister Beatrice, who had decided to accompany them, Edward prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Victoria would notice his absence, would ask questions, and when she found out what he had done, there would be no turning back. But this time, Edward was ready. For the first time in years, he felt truly awake, truly alive. And he would not rest until the whole truth came out, and his mother received the justice she deserved. The storm was about to break over St. Helen's estate, and when it did, it would sweep away all the lies that had poisoned that family for so long. Julia Travers had never been one to accept ready-made answers. Since she was little, she questioned everything, seeking to understand the why of each thing. This trait, which her mother had always tried to suppress by calling it rebelliousness, was in fact a sharp intelligence inherited from the grandmother she barely knew. That Sunday morning, as her parents prepared for breakfast, Julia sensed something different in the air. There was a palpable tension in the house, a heavy silence that went beyond the usual. She watched her father, noticing how he seemed more alert, more present. And she watched her mother, observing the way Victoria watched him with narrow, calculating eyes. After breakfast, when Victoria left to take a call in the study, Julia followed her father to the library. "Edward, darling, come here. I need to talk to you about something important for the party." "Dad, what's going on?" Julia whispered, closing the door behind her. Edward looked at his daughter, debating how much he should reveal. But he saw in her blue eyes the same determination he saw in his own mother's, and he knew Julia deserved to know the truth. "Your grandmother is alive," he said simply, watching the young woman's reaction. Julia turned pale, her legs weakening. She had to lean on the reading table. "How? Where?" Edward told her everything in a low, quick voice. Amelia's discovery, the visit to the clinic, the reunion with Mrs. Helen. With each word, he saw his daughter's face shift from disbelief to anger, from anger to determination. "Mum did this?" Julia asked, her voice trembling but firm. "She hid Grandma all these years and made us believe she was dead." "It seems so. And there's more. Your grandmother said she discovered financial discrepancies, that your mother was stealing from the company. That's why she silenced her." Julia clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "Where is Grandma now?" "In the guest house. She's safe but frail. Julia, I need you to be strong now. I need your help to find proof of what your mother did." The young woman's eyes shone with determination. "Tell me what I need to do." Edward explained that they needed concrete evidence before involving the police. Documents, bank records, anything that would prove the embezzlement and the conspiracy to falsely commit Mrs. Helen. But where to look? Victoria was meticulous, careful. She wouldn't leave obvious traces. "She keeps everything on the computer in her study," Julia said thoughtfully. "She's always been obsessed with having everything digitized. Says it's safer than paper, that it can't be stolen or burned. But she protects that computer like it's gold." "Do you know the password?" Edward asked. Julia bit her lip. "No, but I can try to figure it out. I know she uses important dates. I've seen her typing it a few times, never paid much attention, but maybe I can remember the pattern." "It's very risky," Edward pondered, but they didn't have many options. That afternoon, while Victoria was busy with business calls in the living room, Julia seized the opportunity. She went up the stairs silently, her bare feet making no sound on the carpet. Victoria's study was on the second floor, a spacious room overlooking the gardens. Decorated in shades of grey and white, everything minimalist and controlled like its owner. The door was unlocked, a rare occurrence. Julia entered and closed it softly behind her. The computer was on the glass desk, the screen dark. She approached and pressed the power button, her heart pounding in her chest. The login screen appeared, requesting a password. Julia took a deep breath. She first tried Victoria's date of birth. Incorrect password. Then she tried her parents' wedding anniversary. Incorrect again. She was starting to panic when she remembered something. A day she had seen her mother whisper a date to herself while typing. It was a date that had always seemed strange to Julia because it didn't correspond to any birthday or family event she knew of. She typed in the numbers, the month, and the year. The computer unlocked. Julia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She was in. Now, where to look? She opened the Documents folder, finding hundreds of files meticulously organized by category. Contracts, financial reports, correspondence, audits. It was in a folder named Personal that she found something that caught her attention, a file titled HT. She clicked on it and began to read. It was an email exchange between Victoria and someone identified only as AF. The messages were cautious but revealing. She found out about the transfers, read one message from Victoria. "We need to act fast. The committal needs to seem necessary and irreversible." AF's reply was equally cold. "I can arrange the diagnosis. Is there any precedent for early-onset dementia in her family? We need a convincing narrative." Julia felt nausea rising in her stomach as she continued to read. There were messages detailing how Victoria had started adding substances to Mrs. Helen's tea to induce confusion and disorientation. There were discussions about which clinic would be more discreet, more willing to accept generous payments to maintain silence. And then the message that sealed it all. "The death certificate is ready. Our contact at the registry office did an impeccable job. Officially, Helen Travers died of cardiac complications. Edward signed all the documents yesterday. He was still under the effect of the medication. He doesn't remember a thing." Julia had to cover her mouth to keep from screaming. Her mother had drugged her father, forged documents, paid people to create a false narrative of death. And who was this AF? She kept searching and found references to Dr. August Ferrer, the director of the clinic. But there was another name too, another doctor. Dr. Richard Almeida. Curious, she searched for that name and found a folder hidden within another folder, disguised with a generic name. When she opened it, her stomach churned. There were photographs, intimate messages, records of meetings. Victoria was having an affair with this Dr. Richard, and from the emails, it was clear he was more than just a lover. He was her partner in crime. "With the money we've already transferred, we can start our life together soon," read a message from Victoria. "Edward will never find out. He's so doped up he barely knows what day it is, and with Helen permanently silenced, there's no one to ask inconvenient questions." Julia began copying the files to a flash drive she had brought. There were dozens of documents, gigabytes of information. While the transfer was in progress, she continued to explore. She found detailed spreadsheets of the illegal transfers, offshore accounts, shell companies created to launder the money. Victoria had embezzled millions from the family company over the years. The transfer was almost complete when Julia heard footsteps in the corridor. Her blood ran cold. Quickly she closed the programs, making sure to clear the access history. She grabbed the flash drive as the final progress bar completed and tucked it into the pocket of her jeans. The study door opened. Victoria entered, stopping abruptly when she saw her daughter there. "Julia?" Her voice was icy. "What are you doing in here?" "I was looking for you," Julia lied, forcing her voice to sound casual. "I wanted to know if I can go out with my friends tonight." Victoria crossed the room, her eyes fixed on her daughter. "And you needed to come into my study to ask that?" "The door was open. I thought you were in here." Julia maintained her composure, but her heart was beating uncontrollably. Victoria approached the computer, touching the mouse. The screen was still warm. Her eyes narrowed. "Have you been on my computer?" "Of course not. Why would I do that?" There was a moment of palpable tension, the two women staring at each other. Finally, Victoria took a step back. "You can go out with your friends, but be back by 10. And, Julia," she added, her voice laced with a veiled threat, "do not enter my study again without permission. Privacy is important, even in a family." Julia nodded and left, forcing herself to walk slowly, calmly, when all she wanted to do was run. As soon as she was out of the study and had closed the door, she allowed herself to breathe. She had done it. She had the proof. She found her father in the guest house talking with Mrs. Helen. Her grandmother looked better, more alert. She had bathed, was wearing clean clothes Amelia had provided, and her hair was combed. But there was still a fragility about her. Years of confinement and abuse didn't disappear in a day. "Dad, I got it," Julia said, entering and quickly closing the door behind her. "I have everything." She showed him the flash drive and began to report what she had found. Edward listened, his face growing paler, his hands clenched into fists. Mrs. Helen closed her eyes, silent tears streaming down her face. "She poisoned me," Mrs. Helen whispered. "I remember now." The tea tasted strange, but she insisted it was a new flavor she had discovered, and then everything would get confusing, my thoughts would get jumbled. "And she was drugging." "You too, Dad," Julia added. "The medication you've been taking for years, I bet it's not what she says it is. That's why you always felt so tired, so distant." Edward ran his hands over his face. "How was I so blind? How did I let this happen?" "It wasn't your fault, son," Mrs. Helen said, reaching out to touch his face. "She's clever, manipulative. People like that know exactly how to control us without us even realizing it." Mr. Anthony, who had been silent until then, finally spoke. "What do we do now, Mr. Edward? We have proof. We have Mrs. Helen back. Is it time to involve the authorities?" Edward nodded. "Yes, but we have to do this right. Victoria has connections, she has money, she has resources. If we make one false move, she could flee or destroy further evidence." That evening, as the family had dinner, the tension at the table was almost unbearable. Victoria maintained a facade of normality, talking about the upcoming party, about changes she wanted to make to the house's decor. But her eyes kept returning to Julia, watching, assessing. Edward forced himself to eat, to participate in the conversation, to act, as if nothing had changed. But inside he was planning. The next morning he would go into town, find a trusted solicitor, someone who could advise them on how to proceed legally. And then they would hand everything over to the police. After dinner, when Victoria went up to her room, Edward and Julia gathered again in the guest house with Mrs. Helen. They connected the flash drive to a laptop Mr. Anthony had provided and began to review all the documents. It was worse than they had imagined. It wasn't just millions embezzled, it was tens of millions. Victoria had systematically bled the company dry for years. "And there's something else," Julia said, opening a specific folder. She was planning to sell the estate. There are preliminary contracts here, agreements with property developers. She was going to turn all of this into a luxury housing development and disappear with the money. Mrs. Helen sobbed. "This land has been in the family for 4 generations. It's our history, our legacy." "And it will continue to be," Edward promised, hugging his mother. "I won't let her destroy what we've taken so long to build." The next morning, Edward woke early and prepared to go into town. But when he came down for breakfast, he found the house strangely quiet. Victoria wasn't in the dining room, which was unusual. She always made a point of having breakfast promptly at 7. He looked for her in the study, in their bedroom, in the gardens. Nothing. It was then that he noticed her car was missing from the garage. He felt a tightness in his chest. Had she fled? Had she found out they knew? Julia appeared, still in her pajamas, her eyes wide with worry. "Dad, Mum's not in her room, and some of her suitcases are gone." "Damn it," Edward cursed, something he rarely did. "She must have suspected something. I have to go after her." "But where would she go?" Julia asked. Edward thought quickly. If Victoria was fleeing, she would probably try to leave the country. She had money in offshore accounts. She had a lover waiting. She would try to start a new life far from England. But first, she would need documents, cash, to prepare her escape properly. "She must have gone to London," Edward concluded. "That's where she has the easiest international access. I have to alert the authorities before she boards a flight." Mr. Anthony ran into the room holding a phone. "Mr. Edward, a call from the clinic in Cheltenham. Sister Beatrice is on the line. She says it's urgent." Edward took the phone, his heart racing. "Sister, What's happened? Mr. Edward, the nun's voice was trembling. Dr. Ferrer has fled. He took all the files, destroyed the computers. The police are here. Someone reported irregularities at the clinic. They're investigating all admissions from the last 10 years. Edward processed the information quickly. That's good, sister. It means the truth is coming out. Are you safe? I am, but I needed to warn you. If Dr. Ferrer has fled, your wife may be planning the same thing. She's already gone, Edward confirmed, but I won't let her get away. After hanging up, Edward picked up the phone again and called the Oakhaven police. He explained the situation briefly, asked them to issue a search warrant. He mentioned the documents they had as proof, offered to hand everything over immediately. The officer in charge, Inspector Joseph Barrett, a man of 50 with a reputation for being strict but fair, took the report seriously. Bring the documents in immediately, Mr. Travers, and I'll notify the National Crime Agency. If your wife tries to leave the country, she will be intercepted. While Edward prepared to go to the station, Julia had an idea. Dad, Mum has a flat in London that she thinks no one knows about. I heard her mention it once on a call. It's in Knightsbridge. I think that's where she keeps important documents, maybe even cash. How do you know this? Julia hesitated. Sometimes I listen to her calls. I know it's not right, but I always felt she was hiding things. Edward hugged his daughter. You're smarter than I ever was. Thank you, sweetheart. I'll pass this information on to the police. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Edward went to the police station with Mr. Anthony, taking the flash drive with all the evidence. Inspector Barrett reviewed the documents with his team, his eyes widening with each new file he opened. This is extremely serious, Mr. Travers, he said. Fraud, forgery, kidnapping, embezzlement. Your wife will answer for many crimes. And Dr. Ferrer, Edward asked. He needs to be held accountable too. We've issued a warrant for him as well. The NCA is tracking them both. If they try to leave the country, they will be apprehended. Meanwhile, in London, Victoria was in her secret flat, a luxurious penthouse she had bought years ago with embezzled money. She was packing documents, jewelry, cash. She had realized something was wrong when she saw Julia in the study, when she noticed the computer had been accessed. Her daughter had always been too clever for her own good. She picked up the phone and called Richard, her lover and accomplice. We need to move up the plans, she said without preamble. They know. What do you mean they know? His voice was tense. It doesn't matter how. The point is, we need to leave the country now. Did you get the fake documents? I did. We can board a flight to Geneva tomorrow morning and from there continue on to South America. Perfect, I'll meet you at the airport. But Victoria didn't know her call was being traced. The National Crime Agency already had a wiretap warrant, and every word she said was being recorded, every move monitored. When she tried to leave the flat that evening, she found NCA agents waiting in the building's lobby. Victoria Travers, one of them asked, showing his identification. You are under arrest for fraud, forgery, and other crimes. You have the right to remain silent. Victoria thought about running, about screaming, about using her charm to convince them it was all a misunderstanding. But she saw in the agent's eyes that it was no use. She was cornered. When the news reached Oakhaven, Edward felt immense relief. Julia cried, not from sadness, but from relief mixed with the pain of seeing her mother arrested. Mrs. Helen simply closed her eyes and thanked heaven that the truth had finally come to light. St. Helen's estate, which for so long had lived under the shadow of lies and manipulation, could finally begin to breathe again. But the journey to healing was only just beginning. The months following Victoria's arrest were a time of intense transformation for the Travers family. St. Helen's estate, which had for so long lived under an atmosphere of control and lies, was finally beginning to breathe the air of truth. Mrs. Helen was officially declared alive by the courts. The false documents attesting to her death were nullified, and a criminal case was opened against everyone involved in the fraud. The Acacia Rest Home was shut down by the authorities after an investigation revealed dozens of cases similar to Mrs. Helen's. People committed against their will, false diagnoses, deceived families. Dr. August Ferrer was arrested trying to flee to Morocco, and Dr. Richard Almeida, Victoria's lover, was captured in a luxury hotel in Geneva. The matriarch spent her first weeks back home recovering physically and emotionally. The years of confinement had taken their toll, but Mrs. Helen possessed an inner strength that surprised everyone. With the support of Sister Beatrice, who accepted Edward's invitation to remain at the estate as his mother's private nurse and companion, the elderly woman began to reclaim her dignity and her joy for life. Amelia was also invited to stay. Her temporary contract became permanent, no longer as staff for the party that never happened, but as an essential part of the family she had helped to save. She became Mrs. Helen's personal assistant, helping her with daily tasks and becoming a close friend. Edward, free from the substances Victoria had secretly administered in his medication for years, seemed like a new man. The fog that had clouded his thoughts had lifted, and he could finally see clearly how much of his own life he had lost. The family business required a complete restructuring. An audit revealed the extent of the financial embezzlement, and Edward worked tirelessly to recover what he could and rebuild the company's reputation. Julia matured years in a matter of months. The young woman who had been brave enough to challenge her mother and seek the truth became a driving force in the family's recovery. She began attending company meetings, learning about the family business, and showing a natural aptitude for leadership that impressed even the most seasoned executives. One Saturday morning, 4 months after Victoria's arrest, the family gathered in the living room. Mrs. Helen was seated in her favorite armchair near the window overlooking the gardens where the jasmine bloomed abundantly. She had regained weight, her white hair was well kept, and the sparkle had returned to her eyes. Edward and Julia sat close to her, while Sister Beatrice, Amelia, Mr. Anthony, and Mrs. Martha also joined the group. "I have a proposal to make to all of you," Mrs. Helen began, her voice firm and clear. "What happened to me was not an isolated case. There are thousands of people across the country, especially the elderly, who suffer similar abuses. They are committed against their will, falsely diagnosed, separated from their families. I want to use my experience, my resources, and this property to create something that can help them." Edward leaned forward, interested. "What do you have in mind, Mother?" "I want to transform part of this estate into a center for shelter and support for elderly people who have been victims of neglect, exploitation, or wrongful committal. A place where they can recover, receive psychological support, legal assistance, to reclaim their rights and, above all, dignity. We can call it the Helen Travers Institute for Elder Protection." Julia felt her eyes fill with tears. "Grandma, that's wonderful. I want to help. I want to be involved in every step of this project." "And I will finance everything necessary," Edward added, holding his mother's hand. "It's the least I can do after failing to protect you when you needed it most." Mrs. Helen squeezed her son's hand. "You didn't fail, Edward. You were a victim as much as I was, but now together we can turn this pain into something positive, into hope for other people." Sister Beatrice offered to coordinate the project. She had experience in elderly care, knew the difficulties they faced, and most importantly, had a heart dedicated to service. Amelia would be her assistant, and Julia would take on the administrative and outreach side of the institute. In the following weeks, the project took shape. The west wing of the manor, which had been closed for years, was renovated and adapted to receive the first residents. Spacious and comfortable rooms were prepared. A common room was created, and the gardens were expanded to include areas for occupational therapy. Mrs. Helen's grand piano, which had been covered by a cloth during the years of her absence, was restored and placed in the Institute's main hall. Music had returned to the house. While all this was happening, the criminal case against Victoria was proceeding. The trial was set for 6 months after her arrest. Edward knew he would have to face her again, would have to testify, to relive all the betrayal and pain. But he was prepared. The truth needed to be told. A week before the trial, Edward received an unexpected visit from a solicitor. The man, middle-aged, in a dark suit and with a serious expression, brought a letter. "Mr. Travers, I'm your wife's solicitor," he began. "She asked me to deliver this to you personally. It's a letter she wrote in prison." Edward took the envelope, feeling its symbolic weight. Part of him didn't want to read it, didn't want to give Victoria the opportunity to try to manipulate him one more time. But there was another part, perhaps naive, that needed to understand, needed to know why. After the solicitor left, Edward sat alone in his study and opened the letter. Victoria's elegant handwriting covered 3 pages of yellowed paper. "Edward, I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness. I know what I did is unforgivable in the eyes of anyone with a shred of decency, but I need you to know the truth, not the version the lawyers will present in court, but the real truth, the one that lives in the heart. When we met, I was 23, and you were 34. I was poor, with no family, no future. You were the heir to an empire, handsome, kind, everything a girl could dream of. When you chose me, I thought it was a miracle, but I soon discovered that miracles have a price. Your mother never truly accepted me. She was polite, cordial, but I could see in her eyes that I wasn't good enough for her son. I was the stranger, the outsider who was far too lucky to be there. And maybe she was right. Maybe I really didn't deserve you or this life. But I got used to the luxury, the power, the security that money brings. And when Julia was born, I swore to myself that my daughter would never go, through the hardships I had, that she would have everything, always. I started small, little embezzlements here and there, amounts no one would notice. But money is like a drug. The more you have, the more you want. And I wanted a lot. I wanted the certainty that I would never again be the poor girl depending on the charity of others. When your mother found out, I panicked. Helen confronted me one afternoon, showed me the spreadsheets, the transfers. She said she was going to tell you, that she was going to report me. I begged, I cried, but she was adamant. She said I had betrayed the family's trust and would have to face the consequences. That's when I met Richard. He was a doctor at the clinic where I took your mother for a routine checkup. We talked, he sensed my desperation, and he offered me a solution. We could have her committed, declare her incompetent, make it seem like she was losing her mind. It was supposed to be temporary, just until I could cover my tracks, fix the accounts. But temporary became permanent. And you, Edward, you were so tired, so overwhelmed, it was easy to convince you that the medication was necessary, that it was for your own good. Every day you became more distant, more pliable. I had complete control, and it gave me a sense of power I had never experienced. I am not proud of what I did. I don't expect you to understand or forgive, but I want you to know that despite everything, there was love. In the beginning, before ambition and fear consumed everything, I truly loved you. And Julia, our beautiful, intelligent daughter, she was always genuine. Every moment with her was real. I will pay for my crimes. I know that, and perhaps it's what I deserve. But before it's all over, I needed you to know that not everything was a lie. There were true moments between us, moments I cherish even now. Take care of Julia. She is better than I ever was. She has your kind heart and your mother's intelligence. She will do great things. Victoria. Edward slowly folded the letter and put it in his desk drawer. There were tears in his eyes, not of forgiveness, but of mourning for what could have been and never was. Yes, perhaps there had, perhaps, been love in the beginning. But true love doesn't destroy, doesn't manipulate, doesn't betray, and what Victoria had done was exactly that. On the day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. The case had drawn national attention, becoming a symbol of the vulnerability of the elderly and the abuses they suffered. Mrs. Helen was present, sitting in the front row next to Edward and Julia. She wore an elegant navy blue suit, her hair impeccably styled, her bearing dignified, a woman who had survived the worst and emerged stronger. When Victoria entered, handcuffed and escorted by guards, a tense silence fell over the room. She looked at the family that had once been hers. Her gaze met Julia's, and for a brief moment there was genuine pain in her eyes. Julia looked away, tears streaming silently down her face. She loved her mother, but she could not forgive what she had done. The trial lasted 3 days. Witnesses were called, evidence was presented, the full story was revealed in painful detail. The defense solicitor tried to argue that Victoria suffered from psychological disorders, that the circumstances of her difficult childhood explained her actions, but the prosecution was relentless, showing the premeditation, the meticulous planning, the coldness with which each crime had been executed. Edward was called to testify. He took the stand with trembling legs but a firm voice. He told of the years of manipulation, of how he had been slowly drugged and controlled, of the loss of his mother, and the years of mourning for someone who was alive. He also spoke of Julia, of how his daughter had been brave enough to seek the truth, even knowing it would destroy the family she knew. Mrs. Helen also testified. In a clear and serene voice, she described the months of confinement, the loneliness, the despair of believing she had been forgotten by everyone she loved. But she also spoke of hope, of the faith that had kept her alive, of the certainty that one day the truth would be revealed. When the jury retired to deliberate, it took only 4 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty, on all charges: fraud, forgery, kidnapping, embezzlement, conspiracy. The sentence was 20 years in prison, with no possibility of parole. Victoria received the sentence with no visible emotion. She simply nodded, as if she already knew what the outcome would be. But as she was led out of the room, she turned one last time and looked at Edward. She whispered something that only he could read on her lips. "I'm sorry." He didn't reply. He just turned and hugged his mother and daughter, the two women who truly mattered in his life. Dr. Richard Almeida and Dr. August Ferrer were also convicted, receiving sentences of 15 and 18 years respectively. Justice had been done, but the satisfaction Edward had expected to feel did not come. There was only a void, a sadness for the futility of it all. 6 months. After the trial, the Helen Travers Institute for Elder Protection officially opened its doors. The inauguration ceremony was modest but significant. Local authorities attended, as did representatives from human rights organizations and various media outlets. But the real focus was on the first residents, 12 elderly people who had gone through situations similar to Mrs. Helen's. There was Mrs. Applegate, an 80-year-old lady who had been committed by her own daughter so she could sell her flat. Mr. Benedict, a 75-year-old widower whose nephews had declared him incompetent to take control of his pension. Mrs. Rose, a retired teacher who had spent 3 years in a private clinic under a false diagnosis of Alzheimer's. Each brought a story of abuse, neglect, and injustice, but they also brought resilience, a will to start over, a hope that better days would come. Mrs. Helen cut the inaugural ribbon, surrounded by her family and the new residents. Moved, she gave a short but powerful speech. "This place is not just a refuge for those who have suffered," she began, her firm voice echoing through the hall. "It is a symbol that the truth always prevails, that no injustice can remain forever in the shadows. It is a commitment that as long as there are people willing to fight for human dignity, there will be hope. And above all, it is a home where everyone is welcome, where everyone is family." The applause was warm and sincere. Julia stood beside her grandmother, her eyes shining with pride. Edward watched everything with a heart overflowing with gratitude. His mother had not only survived the most terrible ordeal one could imagine, she had transformed that pain into purpose, into something bigger than herself. In the following months, the Institute flourished. Mrs. Helen's piano once again filled the house with music, played not only by her but by several of the residents who had been musicians in their past lives. The gardens, tended by everyone under the guidance of a professional landscaper, became a spectacle of colors and scents. And the jasmine, that fragrant jasmine that had always been the hallmark of St. Helen's estate, bloomed more abundantly than ever. Julia decided to defer university for a year to dedicate herself fully to the Institute. She discovered a passion for social work, for advocating for just causes, for the feeling of making a real difference in people's lives. Edward supported her decision, recognizing that his daughter needed that time to process everything that had happened and to discover who she really was, away from Victoria's shadow. The family business also recovered. With transparent management and restored ethics, new investors appeared, new contracts were signed. Edward implemented strict auditing and compliance policies, ensuring that what had happened under Victoria's command could never be repeated. But he also made an important decision. He cut his workload in half, delegating more responsibilities to trusted executives. He wanted time to be with his mother, with his daughter, to reclaim the years he had lost in a chemically induced fog. One Saturday afternoon, almost a year after the events that changed everything, Edward found Julia sitting in the garden, watching the sunset. He approached and sat beside her on the soft grass. "What are you thinking about?" he asked gently. Julia was silent for a moment before answering. "I was thinking about Mum. I know what she did was terrible, unforgivable. But sometimes I miss her, the mother I thought she was before I found out the truth." Edward put his arm around his daughter's shoulders. "It's normal to feel that. She was your mother, regardless of her flaws and crimes. You can mourn the loss of the relationship you had without forgiving what she did. The two things can coexist." "Have you forgiven her?" Julia asked, turning to face him. Edward thought carefully before answering. "Not in the traditional sense. I can't forgive what she did to my mother, to our family. But I'm trying to let go of the anger, the resentment. Holding on to them only hurts me more. So I'm choosing to move forward, not for her, but for me, for you, for Grandma." Julia rested, her head on her father's shoulder. "I think it will still take me time to get there. And that's okay. There's no timeline for healing, sweetheart." At that moment, Mrs. Helen appeared, walking slowly but steadily through the garden. At 76, after all she had been through, she still radiated a serene dignity. She approached the two of them and sat on the grass with them, something she had never done in her years as a refined and formal lady. "Look at this place," she said, making a broad gesture with her hand. "How many stories have these lands seen? How many generations have grown up here, loved here, suffered here? And yet it still stands, it continues to flourish. That's what we are, resilient, capable of flourishing, even after the most terrible storms." Edward took his mother's hand. "You're the strongest person I know, Mother." "I'm not strong, son. I just refuse to let evil win. And you two," she looked from Edward to Julia, "are my greatest proof that it was worth resisting. You are my true legacy, not this land, not the money, but you." The three of them sat there as the sun disappeared over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange, pink, and purple. The scent of jasmine filled the air, bringing a sense of peace they hadn't felt in a long time. 2 years after the Institute's inauguration, St. Helens Estate was unrecognizable from the place it had been during Victoria's reign. There was life, laughter, purpose. The Institute now served 30 permanent residents and offered support programs for dozens of families. Julia, who had started her law degree, was specializing in elder law and human rights, frequently bringing colleagues and professors to see the work being done there. Edward, free from the shackles that had bound him for so long, rediscovered his passion for the land. He spent hours in the fields, working side by side with the estate staff, his hands in the earth, his face kissed by the sun. He discovered there was more satisfaction in planting a tree than in closing a multi-million-pound deal. Mrs. Helen became a nationally known figure. She gave talks on elder abuse, worked with legislators to create stricter protection laws, and her story inspired countless people to report similar situations. But her true pleasure was in the musical afternoons at the Institute, when she would sit at the piano and play for the residents, filling the house with melodies that spoke of hope and renewal. Amelia, who had become an inseparable part of the family, found her place in the world. She was no longer the lost young woman desperate for work. She was a competent professional, a loyal friend, a bridge between the painful past and the promising future of the Travers family. Mr. Anthony continued as the silent heart of the house, keeping everything running with his quiet efficiency. Mrs. Martha still reigned in the kitchen, but now she cooked for an extended family that included all the Institute's residents. And Sister Beatrice had found her perfect calling, coordinating the care work with the wisdom of years of experience and a genuine love for every person under her care. One spring morning, 3 years after Victoria's trial, a letter arrived at the estate. It was from her, written from prison. Edward hesitated to open it, but Julia, who was there when the post arrived, encouraged him. "Maybe she has something important to say, Dad. And if she doesn't, you can just throw it away." Edward opened the letter. It was short, just half. A page written by hand. "Edward and Julia, I don't expect a reply to this letter. I just wanted you to know that I've been following the work of the Institute on television and in the newspapers. What you are doing is extraordinary. Helen has turned her pain into something beautiful, and you have supported her on that journey. I have a lot of time to think in here, and I've realized that physical prison is nothing compared to the prison I built for myself over the years. A prison of ambition, fear, greed. You are truly free, something I never managed to be. Julia, my daughter, you are everything I should have been but never was. Continue to be that light, that force for good. Your father is a better man than I deserve, and your grandmother is living proof that the human spirit is unbreakable. I don't ask for forgiveness, I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to know that despite everything, I love you. I always have, in my own imperfect and selfish way. Victoria." Edward folded the letter and put it in his pocket. He wouldn't reply, but he wouldn't throw it away either. It was part of their story, however painful it might be. And stories need to be remembered so that mistakes are not repeated. At the end of the afternoon, the family gathered in the gardens, as had become a Saturday tradition. They were all there: Edward, Mrs. Helen, Julia, Amelia, Mr. Anthony, Mrs. Martha, Sister Beatrice, and many of the Institute's residents who had also become family. A long table had been set up among the jasmine bushes, covered with a white linen tablecloth, and laden with food prepared with love by Mrs. Martha. There was laughter, lively conversation, stories being shared. Children from the nearby village, invited by Julia as part of a generational integration program, ran between the tables, bringing life and joy. Mrs. Helen watched it all, her eyes shining. Her son by her side, strong and present. Her granddaughter, beautiful and determined, distributing smiles and hugs. The friends who had become family. The land she loved, flourishing around her. Edward noticed his mother's gaze and drew closer. "Are you happy, Mother?" She took his hand, squeezing it with a strength surprising for her age. "Happier than I thought it was possible to be again. You know, son, when I was in that clinic, in the darkest moments, there was only one thing that kept me alive. It was the scent of the jasmine. I would close my eyes and remember the garden, the afternoons playing the piano, you as a child running among the flowers, and I knew that somehow one day I would come home." "And you did," Edward said, his voice thick with emotion, "and you transformed this place into something even more beautiful than it was. It wasn't just me, it was you, it was Julia, it was Amelia, it was every person who chose to believe that truth matters, that justice is worth fighting for. Together we built something that will last beyond us." At that moment, Julia approached, bringing with her a lady who had recently arrived at the Institute. "Grandma, Dad, I'd like you to meet Mrs. Lords. She just arrived and is a little lost. I thought you could make her feel welcome." Mrs. Helen stood up immediately, extending her arms to the new resident. "Welcome to our home, dear. You are safe here. You are with family." The woman burst into tears, and Mrs. Helen hugged her with the tenderness of someone who knew exactly that pain, that relief, that overwhelming gratitude of finally being safe. Edward watched the scene with a full heart. His mother, who had suffered so much, was now comforting others who suffered. The cycle of pain had been broken and transformed into a cycle of healing and hope. When the sun finally set and the stars began to appear in the sky, most of the guests had already departed. Only Edward, Mrs. Helen and Julia remained in the gardens, sitting on a wooden bench surrounded by jasmine. "You know what I've learned from all of this?" Julia said, breaking the comfortable silence. "I've learned that family isn't just about blood, it's a choice. It's about being there. It's about fighting for each other. Amelia, Mr. Anthony, Sister Beatrice, all the residents here, they are all our family just as much as we are to each other." "Your grandmother taught all of us that," Edward said, looking at Mrs. Helen with admiration. "She could have shut herself away in bitterness. She could have given up. But she chose love. She chose to serve. She chose to transform trauma into purpose. Mrs. Helen smiled, her eyes misty. "I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just refused to let evil have the last word, and I discovered that when we face the darkness with light, the light always wins." The three of them sat there for a while longer, in a comfortable silence, just enjoying each other's company and the scent of jasmine that filled the night air. There were no more secrets between them, no more lies poisoning their love. Only truth, forgiveness for themselves for the times they had been blind, and gratitude for having found their way back to each other. St. Helens Estate, which for generations had been the home of the Travers family, was now a home to many. Its walls, which had witnessed so much pain, had also witnessed healing. Its land, which had been stained by betrayal, was now fertile ground for hope. And its jasmine gardens, those gardens continued to bloom, generation after generation, reminding all who visited that even in the darkest of nights, there will always be flowers to perfume the way back home. Edward looked at his mother and his daughter, the two most important women in his life, and knew that he was finally at peace. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was full of possibilities. And as long as they were together, as long as they had love and truth as their foundation, they could face anything. The full moon illuminated the gardens, silvering the leaves of the jasmine. And there, on that piece of land in the Cotswold Hills, 3 generations gathered under the starry sky, ready to write new chapters of a story that now spoke not of pain, but of redemption. Not of lies, but of truth. Not of separation, but of union. And the scent of the jasmine lingered, eternal and constant, guiding the way for all who sought to find their way back home. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of the Travers family has deeply touched your hearts. If you were moved by Mrs. Helen's courage, Edward's transformation, Julia's bravery, and the rebirth of this family, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment marked you the most. Here, every day, we bring intense and true stories like this one, which reveal the strength of the human spirit, and show that even in the most difficult situations, there is always hope for a new beginning. The journey of the Travers family teaches us that the truth, however painful, always sets you free, and that true love has the power to transform even the deepest wounds into sources of healing and renewal. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode, with another story that will stir your emotions and make you reflect on what truly matters in life. Until then, may the scent of jasmine guide your paths.